Okay. How are we going, Steph? We got most participants in?
Webby, let's get going.
There's still a couple coming in on my screen here. Matt Cahill's just coming in. All right, thanks everyone for coming to the third and final Carbon Calling virtual field day. We've had the previous two Wednesdays. Some of you would have been to all three. This might be the first one. It's sponsored by the federal government through the Smart Farms grant. We've been doing some research trials on various farmers' properties, different ways that we can store carbon in the system in a practical and adoptable and a repeatable fashion is what we're shooting for, using a variety of different technologies that farmers have access to, be it technology and systems pieces as well. I'd just like to start with a quick welcome to country. I'd like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people who are the traditional custodians of the land. I'd also like to pay respect to elders, both past and present, and the Wiradjuri Nation, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians who may be present. As I've said in the last two meetings, I'm learning a bit of Wiradjuri, and my favourite saying is Dargunna Nana, Nurrumbang Nana, which means care for soil, care for home country, which sets us up for what we're trying to do with this whole project. How do we look at increasing our profitability as farmers, but also increasing the legacy in which we leave behind on the landscape? And I think the two major motivations for farmers is this profit and legacy. And sometimes profit can be at the expense of legacy. What we're trying to do is work a way that we can find to do a virtuous cycle, basically, where you're improving profit at the same time as improving the legacy of your landscape that you're leaving behind you. We've got a pretty exciting lineup. There's a bit of last minute reshuffling this week. Those of you who might have seen last week's ads that came out, we were going to have Niall Blair come and talk about carbon markets and so on. Unfortunately, Niall got called away on a late emergency call and couldn't make it. So on a short time frame, I did a few phone calls around, and luckily enough, we got Toby Grogan from Impact Ag and Angus Ingham from Kilter Rural, who have actually been playing in this carbon and biodiversity space and practitioners in the space. We also have Steve Nicholson, who is a participant in the Climate Resilient Soils Network, which is what we call the research project. One of the 4 growers that were doing different research projects for us. So Steve's a farmer from Forbes near Garima, which is sort of southeast of Forbes. Steve and I have got a long history, did Steve's agronomy for a lot of years. Steve's been really supportive of some new technologies coming through that we've been playing with. And one of the district's leading growers and rightfully proud of his operation. So Steve and I will have a bit of a chat directly about what's happening on his farm with the trials and more broadly with his ambitions around carbon and biodiversity trading. Then I'll have a bit of a look at what the research directions for soil sequester are over the next little while, over the next few years, where we're setting our sails for. Give a quick 10 or 15 minute overview of that, and then we'll dig down on the monetisation of carbon and biodiversity. What do the markets actually look like? How big are they? Where are they? How mature are they? Through practitioners' eyes. So without further ado, what we usually do, we've had Will Reid, who's a videographer, go and take some video on our farmers' properties. Usually we have the farmer on the property with the iPhone and we can show the crop, so it is actually a field day with one there, but Steve's been, he's gone down to the coast lollygagging by the seaside. So he's not on farm. So unless we get an opportunity to see a bit of ocean, Steve, maybe, but yeah, so we won't have anyone actually on farm, but we have a little video that we can play of Steve out in the paddock and some of the things that are going on the farm. So Steph, if you want to run that video, and then Steve and I'll have a chat.
So what we looked at doing here is that we relocate the fences, we try and run our paddocks north-south and work out exactly where the drainage lines need to go and where tree lines need to be planted if necessary. Then we put those fences in and then we just start the project. We fence off our creek line, so the fence line's there, and you keep 100% ground cover at all times. The crop paddocks are then able to be cropped at 100%, so a paddock like that, 20 years continuously cropped, so that's productive country. But you don't have to cause degradation, you don't have to cause erosion, you don't have to cause siltation. None of those things have to happen with the technology we have today. Today's big thing is we're trying to increase soil carbon. That is all new technology, but it's still technology that we have. We can implement it and we're doing it now. If you just implement really first world, best practice, you can start to turn the amount of carbon in those soils and the productivity of those soils, but it takes a long time. Add compost and you help fire it up, help kickstart the whole system, and that's going to shorten that time frame.
In this trial we're looking at ways that soil is made ready to store carbon. So we've chosen barley as the crop here, so it's Latrobe barley, 100 acres, 40 hectares thereabouts. So we've got rows that are treated versus rows that are not, about 20 of them across the paddock. So there's enough there for good strong statistics. So we'll get some good scientific numbers out of it.
In an ideal world, rather than it take us 10, 15, 20 years to take a soil that's, you know, completely depleted up to first-class agricultural soil, we'll shorten that down and we might be able to do that in 3 or 4 years. Because you put soil carbon in there, your soils will be healthier, your crops will grow better, you'll make more money. So everybody wins. The whole thing becomes more sustainable. It'll be a complete game changer if they can make it work. That about sums it up, Guy. I don't think I have to do anything. I can go back down the beach.
That's about it now. Back down to the surfboard, mate. Out into the blue room, the green room. Mate, there's a lot going on that farm on a lot of levels. And we saw bits and pieces of it in that video where you've been working at not just building your soil carbon, but building biodiversity along creek lines, fencing off creek lines, a whole heap of stuff going on there from an environmental point of view. But with that perspective of dovetailing it into your production systems is what I've seen over the years has really been your focus. So you're ticking both that environmental box and the production box, but you can't be green if you're in the red, obviously. So the productivity of your systems improving with those sort of strategies. Just a quick overview on the actual research trial that's on that place. We've basically used compost and also, you didn't have compost in that one, did we? No, it was just, that's why I was last week's seminar with Stewie, we had compost with and without VAM. This is the sister partner trial to that, where we've just got mycorrhizal fungi with VAM fungi on and off across the paddock without any influence of compost at all, and with a different soil type and a different system. So this is a tine sowing system versus a no-till system as well. So we want to compare and contrast a couple of different systems using these types of fungal inoculums. So that data, obviously, we've baselined that and we'll go in and get the carbon data after the crop has actually been harvested, and there's quite a crop in that paddock. So it's been a good season to do a research trial. I'm glad it wasn't 18-19 where there wasn't much carbon growing. But Steve, you might want to just give us a bit of an overview of your strategy on that farm. You've had it for a few years now, and you've obviously kept a real focus on how you want things to turn out and how things have turned out. Can you give us a bit of an overview of what that strategy looks like for you and the motivations behind it?
Yeah, Guy, you saw from the video, we have my sons that run the operation with us. We have this vision that says that you can be profitable and you can be sustainable, but how do you go about it? So it depends on the individual farm. So we looked at that farm when we took it over and said, well, you needed to have a whole farm plan, which
dovetailed into each other. So there was areas that needed to be reclaimed and rejuvenated through just eliminating stock, so fencing off creek lines and things so the stock can't hang on those sort of areas. Soil test the entire place, find out exactly where your baseline is, and then start a process of minimum till, stubble retention, really good weed control, making sure that the crops are profitable, but their overall farm health is increasing. And it's starting to show the dividends are there now. Some of those crops that you saw when that video was taken now are stunningly beautiful cereal crops. And it's a reflection that you can do both. You can actually be sustainable. And my opinion and my son's opinion of sustainability might differ from other people's. Our belief is that basically every year, if you took a snapshot in time, your farm on numerous levels of indicators should be better than it was the year before, given normal seasonal fluctuations. What I'm saying is, so your ground cover should be better each year. You should be able to get it to a stage where it's 100% ground cover all the time. Given droughts, floods, no matter what, you should be able to start building that ground cover. You should have a goal to have better ground cover. Siltation of your creek line should be starting to decrease year on year, getting better and better. So the water's cleaner that's flowing into your dams and across your paddocks. The biodiversity on your farm should be better every year instead of them being just, denuded of everything and just monocultured crops. You don't need to do that. You can have biodiversity. You can have remnant vegetation protected. You can have wildlife corridors. None of that stops you making money, because ultimately you come to the paddock where your production is. What's it doing? Is the soils healthier? Are the crops better? Is the baseline soil data improving? And if it is, then you're sustainable, because sustainability means it's just getting better all the time, and you're therefore going to get better yields. You're going to get better healthy crops. You're going to make more money. And as you said, you can't be green if you're in the red. And that's the problem. All this talk that everybody goes on about is still, in most instances, governed by your financiers. If you're not making money, if you're not making your repayments, and you're not able to improve the machinery and operational stuff on your farms, you're not going to be there. So all the good intentions in the world going to make absolutely no difference, because you're not going to be there. You've got to make money as well. So that's sustainability. So better healthy soils, better biodiversity, less erosion, but more profit.
And some of the systems, I know some of the country, when we first started working together, Steve, there was some tough country amongst it, with across that floodplain country, south the Forbes, where some of the soils are a bit more sodic and so on. But some of the places you started versus where you're at now, I find quite instructful, where you started with some pretty hard soils. And you talk a little bit to some of the processes involved in going from compacted, hard-setting soils through to what you've got there now.
Yes, Guy. Well, that was the start of it. That was 20 years ago. So the original farm, we did some initial soil testing. And basically, the day we arrived, we had paddocks there that had been traditionally farmed for probably 100 years. They had soil carbon levels of 0.01% soil carbon. The best of them was 0.1% soil carbon. Soil grey phosphates of 1 and 2, nitrogens of 1 and 2 and 3. You're talking about completely degraded soils, hard as the hobs of hell. Wouldn't matter what you tried to do. There was no way. They were very sodic. So exchangeable sodiums, 9s, 10s, not unusual to find 12s and 15s. But all of it was fixable with technology. So we decided that in those days, the first thing was to do was to start stubble retention, wasn't it? It was just to treat the paddocks for sodium. So we put out gypsum, weed control, and grow as much biomass as we could and put that biomass back on the top of the soil between crops and try and get it to rot down and start the system going. It's gradually improved as time's gone along. Technology's got better, the machines have got better. We still, no matter what, we've just invested $750,000 on a new seeder out of Germany, which will allow us to get through even more trash without having to be. So it's a time machine, but it'll be able to handle even higher trash loads. And the reason for that is we're starting to get to the stage now where originally we had a philosophy that if you had a crop that yielded more than 5 or 6 tonnes per hectare, we needed to do something with the stubble. So the first thing we did was buy a header that we could cut the stubble and smash it up and spread it. But even at that, we still struggled to get through it if it was a bit of a wet sowing season. Now we're hoping some of these crops at the moment, we're hoping the new seeder will be able to handle 7s and 8s tonnes per hectare stubble residues without having to burn. So
there's a lot in the selection of the machinery used there for the job. A lot of thought gone into how you actually get your crops into the soil and how you manage that stubble. And it has been a really big problem. And I think you've identified one of the big problems of driving through the landscape at the start of this season. It was like the whole wheat belt was on fire because of the big crops last year. How do you sow into great big stubbles unless you've actually got a machine that can do that? And then all of a sudden everything starts to change because you can actually keep your stubbles. Steve, I also just been mindful of time here. We've got a couple of minutes, but just wanted to touch on going forward, what you're seeing going into the future. We're in a time in history where every second article on the internet's about carbon trading in one way or another, in my echo chamber anyway. And there's lots of talk about it. There's lots of talk about opportunity for growers, both in politics at the moment and the general press. Where are you casting your sails to with your business plan going forward with carbon being in that mix?
Well, Guy, early in the piece, I used to speak at field days and tell farmers that carbon was key, but it was based on production, not so much just the trading. I used to say all the time was, don't do it for the trade, don't do it for the trading cash, do it for the productivity increases you're going to get, the better sustainability you're going to have on your operation. But how now world's changed. The carbon price now and what they predicted to be in the future is going to be unbelievable.
Yep. So you're building that into your business plan this year.
Yeah, it's going to be a real key driver. If the carbon price, and now we can stack carbon, means that we can actually put carbon trading into our gross margins. So therefore, it will speed up the amount of cash that's available then to do the other things you need to do, which is the soil emollients, the technology you're developing, better machinery. Farmers will be able to afford to be able to do things because of this cash flow coming in as part of the carbon trading. I'm dying to get going. Like, we've got data there now for 20 years. So the paddock I was talking about, it went from one near my house. We've got 20 years of data. It went from 0.1% organic carbon to it's been tracking constantly at around about 1.8 to 1.9% carbon now. And that's 20 years of consecutive cropping. So it does work. You can build soil carbon, you can farm it. Now we should be allowed to trade it, or we can trade it. It's just coming up with a system that's both simplified enough that most farmers can implement it, and that there's enough in it for the farmer that the traders don't take the cream, that there's enough in there to make it worthwhile doing. And then you'll find the farmers doing it. And one of the big steps is being able to stack, being able to put all the bits and pieces together across your farm to come up with a package of carbon credits and biodiversity credits. It's enough to justify your whole exercise. So, yeah.
Right. Thanks very much, Steve. That's brilliant. And it's really good to see a grower up in the stirrups with all this and really taking on.
I can't hear you there, Guy. Sorry.
Okay. Can everyone else hear me? Steph? Yep.
Just fine.
Yep.
Yeah, mate.
Yeah, now I can.
Okay. Thanks very much for that, Steve. That was really great to see a grower so up in the stirrups and being successful at doing it. So if you want to hold tight, we'll at the end of the session, we'll have an open forum, and I can see some questions already popping up for you there. No doubt there'll be more. So towards the end of the session, we'll have a few questions. The next part of the seminar I'll just give people a bit of an overview of Soil Sequest's vision for the future, where we're tracking. If I can just find a screen to share here. I think this is it. So let's put it on play. Here we go. Can everyone see that all right?
Yep, looks good, Webby.
Do I need to shrink down the people's pictures in the corner there, or is that over the screen?
It's all good.
Only for me. Rightio. So research directions. I thought we'd give just a quick run through. Soil Sequest is all about how we sequester carbon and into the landscape. How do we propose to go about that? That's what takes up a lot of our time, thinking and planning of how that's going to happen. We do a lot with different academic organisations around the place, ANU in particular and others. But Soil Sequest is primarily a grassroots organisation, research organisation. We're a not-for-profit, and we like to focus on what the farmers see. So we want to stand inside the farmer's fence and look at the farm through the lens of the farmer, rather than looking from the outside in. And Steve alluded to it there. You can't be green if you're in the red, but things aren't going to get adopted unless they tick the economic box and tick the practicality box. It's something that could be actually adopted. So we spent a lot of time thinking about that. And from that process, we've come up with an overarching project we call 4D Farmscapes. And it's to do with this thing that I talked about earlier of pulling profit and legacy into a virtuous cycle. So why we call it 4D Farmscapes? Because I think we need to look at the systems we manage, our carbon management zone, in 4 dimensions. So typically, as an agronomist, I'd wander across a paddock and I'd be looking down at weeds, and I'd be looking at the crop to see if it needed some nutrition or had any funguses or diseases, any insects on it. And you kind of concentrate on that crop almost in the 2 dimensions. We spend a lot of time on farms, but the reality is in managing carbon, we're actually dealing in 4 dimensions. So we're length and breadth, and we're also height. And we've got to think about it in scales of time, which is your 4th dimension. So we're not just managing the crops and pastures at 6 inches above the earth. We're actually managing right to the top of the troposphere, which is roughly 11 kilometres up, is where the weather happens. So where the troposphere meets the stratosphere, that's where our rain patterns are. That's where carbon dioxide is building up in the atmosphere and increasing temperatures and making Australia drier and hotter climate to grow crops in. Then we come down to closer to the surface. We've got to manage our structure in our landscape, our trees, our wind flows across that landscape, because winds have a massive impact on what happens with moisture in the landscape, right down to shrubs and all the different structure that we can get in our vegetation. And then we've got to go deeper than the 6 inches that our crops are growing in. We've got to go down as deep as it takes to get down to the aquifer, because it's aquifers we're managing as well, for irrigation and for how aquifers impact on surface waters as well. So the carbon management zone, we've sort of got to take a broader look at what is actually happening there. And we're in that management zone, in that area 11 kilometres above us. We've got all these freebies that exist. So we've got all this carbon, for one, that is generously donated from various industries from around the world, that's building up there. And that's actually a resource for farmers if we can work out how to trap that carbon back down into the landscape. And it is all about how we trap these freebies. So nitrogen is floating around in the air. 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. We don't really want to buy it out of a bag if we can work a strategy to capture it out of the air. Rainfall, moisture, obviously all comes for free out of the air, and we get free sunshine. And gravity is the other thing. Gravity comes for free, and that's something we can actually look at managing for free on our farmscape systems. There's a basic question you really have to ask yourself every time that you're looking at a management option on the farm is what are the physics that are driving this? And in particular, what are the physics that drives carbon? And in a very broad brush way, it's an interesting way to look at it, that of all the moisture that goes through the landscape, all the rainfall that falls on a particular landscape, 80 to 90% of the water goes through vegetation of one sort or another. And the calculation towards carbon is every litre of water makes 1 to 4 grams of carbon. So depending on the efficiency of the plant, some plants are super efficient, like acacias. They're up around 4 grams of carbon for every litre of water, and others are lower than that. So our crops sort of fall into that zone. So broadly, if we think about it in terms of those basic physics that are driving the system, it's a great sort of foundation to help make other decisions. To distill it down even further, to get carbon to build in the landscape, you've got to capture nitrogen and you've got to capture water. You get those two things managed well, and you start building carbon. So to tease that out and think about it more, come down out of the clouds a little bit and think, right, what are the practicalities? How do we look at this carbon building system and this designing the agroecological landscape to benefit production and to benefit carbon sequestration and to benefit biodiversity gains? What are the lenses that we need to look through? So we've divvied them up into all the different things that in agriculture we would need to look through to actually get a bit of a handle on how we calculate the types of carbon opportunities that we might have around us on our farmscapes. So I'll just go through those one by one. This seminar is all our cropping trials this season with the Climate Resilient Soils Network being mainly in the cropping space. So I'll focus mainly on cropping. But there's 6 tiles here that we're looking at, from cropping, livestock, what we call fodder alley sequestration trees, giving it a special tile because of its importance, biodiversity, water, and energy and waste. Let's have a quick look at cropping. What are the sorts of things that we can actually do in cropping that might store carbon? Stuff that Steve was talking about and stuff that Toby and Angus will talk about later, and Albie. Number one, I guess, is the Hippocratic oath that doctors take to do no harm. It's the same on a landscape. Tillage operations, sometimes strategic, but overall, you've got to put it in the context of actually what the physics is saying. And the physics of tillage is that for every tillage operation, depending on the soil type and a few conditions, but roughly about 250 kilos of soil organic carbon is lost per tillage operation. Now, we don't see it disappearing out of the soil because carbon dioxide's a clear, odourless, tasteless gas. So it's like this ghost that disappears out of the soil. I always say to growers that if it was a purple gas that stunk like rotten eggs, then we might take more notice of our carbon disappearing from our soils. But when you do till the soil, you think, righto, what's the strategy here? Am I going 1 step back and 2 steps forward? Or am I going 2 steps back and no steps forward? So you think about it in terms of what physics is telling you. And every time you till, you're losing roughly 250 kilos of soil organic carbon. I took this shot. This is from our first seminar a couple of weeks ago, earlier in the year, with Luke and Alex. This photo just epitomised everything that you can do towards trying to trap carbon in the soil. So we have Luke on the right there looking at his paddock, and he's got a mindset on soil fertility. So that's probably the first thing you need to start with, is actually be trying to get your soil more fertile and digging and delving into ways you can do that. He's got a zero-till planter planting into stubble retention that was a arrowleaf legume crop, so he's got a legume in rotation. He's got that machinery on controlled traffic, so he's not compressing his soil and taking all the air spaces out of the porosity out of his soil. So he's keeping his soil tilth and nice and effective. And in this particular instance, we've inoculated the canola with a soil carbon inoculum on the seed, just as a cherry on top of the whole system. But that's a photo of a pretty complete system for carbon sequestration. That's the crop. Angus, you asked earlier what the crop looks like. That's it. A week or so ago, 970 canola, looking brilliant, got an understory of arrowleaf that's coming through it, fixing nitrogen all the way through. That crop hasn't had any urea at all, and it will probably, the wheat crop that'll follow it will not need urea either, because we'll strip that canola, and the arrowleaf will have been pumping nitrogen into the soil all season long, hopefully enough for a wheat crop next year. So that'll be 3 seasons in a row with 3 big crops with no synthetic nitrogen applied. Why is synthetic nitrogen the bogeyman in the room? I guess it's, you know, I've spent a lot of time in agronomy and I've sold a lot of tons of urea. So I can't claim holy ground that I've never used urea. It's a great tool, makes things grow. If you haven't got any nitrogen in the soil and you're going to cop it in the neck for yield, then, you know, you've got to make that economic decision and apply it. But again, it asks the question, what does the physics say? And the physics and the biochemistry around urea is that it has a massive carbon footprint. And if you're trying to trade carbon and you're assessing your total farm footprint, urea has one of the biggest one. It costs the same amount of energy to make a kilo of urea as it does to make a kilo of steel. And that's most of it's made over in Qatar, the other side of the world. They manufacture it with this huge carbon footprint, chuck it in a boat, a big steel boat, and burn a heap of diesel to get it over to Newcastle port. We throw it in a big steel truck, use a heap of diesel to get it out to Forbes. So we throw it in a big steel spreader and tow it with a big steel tractor, burn a heap more diesel and spread it out over the paddock. Wash it in with a little bit of rain and lose about 50% of it back up into there, some of which is a greenhouse gas nitrous oxide with 310 times the global warming potential as carbon dioxide. So really potent greenhouse gas. So that it's almost obscene when you think about it in terms like that. The carbon footprint of urea is somewhere around a bit over 5 tonnes of CO2 equivalent for every tonne of urea manufactured. So it's got this great big footprint. So it's really hard when you're doing carbon accounting, if you're using a whole heap of this substance to grow your crops, then it's a hard one to battle against. One of my growers likened urea to heroin. First time he used it, it was almost impossible to get off. And there's a good reason for that. The science is pretty clear on that, particularly as you're getting up into higher rates of urea, it actually shuts down a lot of the organisms in the soil responsible for manufacturing nitrogen in your soil. And also it's in the form that stimulates a certain type of microbe that likes to eat carbon voraciously. So although you're growing more biomass, you're growing more carbon by putting synthetic nitrogen on, you're burning it just as fast, and the net gain is pretty much zero. So not that great for your nitrogen cycle in your soil and a great big carbon footprint. So what do we do to get around that? In a cropping system, things like multi-species cover cropping. So this is Mick last year growing a multi-species cover crop. You can see the 4-wheeler in there. It was a fairly decent crop. It was a good year last year. Lots of legumes in that system. So we've got these nodules that are making nitrogen for free, sucking it out of the air and stabilising it in the soil. We want to let the water in as well. So we get some diversity of roots, some tillage radish and various things to actually produce the physical channels to be able to take the water from the surface down into the subsoil, which is where we want that water to go. The subsoil is the bucket where we want to store the water. Lots of different types of plants in a multi-species cover crop, obviously, where you've got a diversity of exudates that come off those roots, and you're feeding a diversity of microbes, and you start setting up a soil food web that has a nitrogen cycle component to it and other nutrients. So you start building nitrogen in your system from legumes and from multiple root types in that soil that kickstart your soil food web to drive the nitrogen cycle. So you're getting that free nitrogen coming down into your system from that 78% nitrogen that's in the air, rather than out of a bag. That paddock was crimp rolled. So this is a non-chemical termination with a chevron pattern roller that just crimps over the crop to try to create cover while leaving the roots intact. So you hang on, jump one there. So what Mick Wettenhall affectionately calls his one-way valve. So you let the water in, but don't let it out. So you've got all these root holes to let the moisture down deeper into the profile, but you've got this cover on top of the soil that prevents evaporation taking that water out. So it's a great way to store more water in the soil. So when you've got two cockies having a beer together and they say, how much rain did you get, mate? You want to be able to say, we got all of it. And this is a great example of it. So you can see the conventional tillage system on the right. This was actually after 3 fast inches of rain came dumped on this landscape. No-till and cover crops on the left-hand side. And you can see straight away, the eyes can tell you what's going on there. The no-till cover crop system has actually absorbed all that rain, even though it was fast and hard. It wasn't too much for the paddock. It just soaked it up like a sponge. Where the one on the right, that water's going to run down the table drain and away from the paddock. So you haven't captured that opportunity of that rainfall event because you haven't managed the soil to be receptive to rain events. And as we go further and further into a changing climate, our storms are going to become more intense, bigger lots of rains, harder and faster, and less of them. So overall, lower rainfall quantities coming to us, but in bigger, heavier events. So we need to get our soils ready for that sort of system. So the other 5 tiles, I might just whip through quickly, just conscious of time here. So livestock, we look at how we can manage livestock. Same sort of thing, I guess the same physical principles are at play, that you want to make sure there's cover on the country versus not. And the strategic planned grazing is obviously a way to do that. We're managing ground temperature as one of the big components in that. The hotter the soil is, the more that more moisture you will lose from that soil. And remembering that nitrogen plus water equals carbon. If you're losing water from the system, you're losing the capacity to make carbon. You can see there 43 degrees on bare ground, 24 on fairly low mode ground, and then 19.5 where you've left a bit of length in the pasture. So we're sort of managing our pastures with that in mind. Again, don't ignore the physics. This Stewie Austin up at Wilmot has been building carbon in his soils up there with this system. Kindly donated this photograph, which he entitled Big Mob Grazing, 1,273 head on 21 hectares. He's got them packed in there pretty well. But the basic principle is high stocking rates, short grazing periods, long rest periods, 100% ground cover 100% of the time, diversified perennial pasture, so diversified root depth and root type to get that nitrogen cycling will give you soil carbon accrual. This is Jeremy Bradley, one of our soil sequesters with a paddock that he's managed over 10 years versus across the fence that wasn't managed. He's done a whole heap of different things here, from deep ripping, but mainly time control grazing and adding compost teas and a whole range of things. And this was taken this year. We did an intensive soil carbon program there, testing the soil carbon on both sides of that fence. Over a 10-year period, Jeremy's drawn down 616 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per hectare in that paddock. But you can see the productivity gains. And what Steve was talking earlier, you don't have to go broke on improving carbon levels in your landscape. In fact, it's actually good for the economics of the system. So just managing those livestock and that pasture biomass across the paddock. Having a look at the biology in the soil, dung beetles are pretty cool. This photo on the right was Luke Wood's paddock. He's got dung beetles in amongst his soil. That was down about 6 inches, that little ball, just a ball of compost. So they take carbon underneath the soil. So it's always worth checking if you've got dung beetles, if you've got cattle. And the soil carbon inoculum, which Soil Carbon Company are developing at the moment, is also, there's work being done on pastures as well to inoculate pastures. The fast carbon, this is my little hobby horse, fodder alley sequestration trees. We were going to call it fodder alley row trees, but we thought the acronym wouldn't go over that well to call something fart carbon. So we've changed it to fast carbon. It's very simple. Again, you've got to adhere to the physics. What are the physics going on a property? And if you can create a microclimate, you actually keep the wind off the deck. And wind has a massive influence in drying out the landscape. So if you can create intersection points for the wind and keep the wind off the paddock, you actually make the paddock hold a lot more water. You make a humid environment that is conducive to better pasture growth. So in these cases, we're choosing fodder trees or shrubs that are leguminous. So they're pumping nitrogen into the soil and they're helping capture moisture in the landscape. So again, water plus nitrogen equals carbon. This was supplied by Terry McCosker from Carbon Link, some baselining work up in Queensland on Lacuna stands. So you can see on the left there, there's 2 paddocks that were baselined, 40 to 41 tonnes per hectare of soil organic carbon per hectare. The one in the middle there with the circle around it was a Lacuna stand, very similar soil types and similar rainfall, obviously, and everything else. The only difference is had Lacuna for a decade or so. And interrow, not counting the trees themselves, interrow had 115 tonnes more soil organic carbon per hectare, about 400 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per hectare more than the adjacent paddocks. If you put a very modest carbon trade to that, it's about $8,000 worth of carbon in those soils per hectare. Tagasasti, over in the west, there's about 100,000 hectares of that planted in various places. Again, keeping the wind off the deck, creating that microclimate so that you can actually store carbon in the interrow. And of course, the shrubs themselves are storing carbon and creating biodiversity as well. Just by the way, they've done quite a few biodiversity studies in old Tagasasti stands, and they're just absolutely chock-a-block full of little birds that weren't there before. We're doing a little bit at Forbes with some research on different ways of managing tag. This just to show, this is a row of Tagasasti over near Burrawa. I pulled up and took a photo of it because you could see, this was this year, you can see the pasture growing right up underneath that line. So the Tagasasti itself got really deep roots and doesn't compete with the grass growing beside it. Saltbush, an oldie but a goodie. It's not a legume. My thought is that you must put some legume component in with saltbush stands so you keep the nitrogen cycle rolling. This is one near Forbes, quite a bit of mallee planted around Forbes. Not a big fan. This was planted for carbon sequestration. Yes, the trees have sequestered carbon, but at the expense of the environment in between the trees. You can see that middle little shot there. They've taken a photo of the soil surface where it's quite badly eroded. So it's horses for courses. You've got to pick the right plants for the right job. This influence of wind, it's a really big one, and I don't think we manage it very well across the landscape. It's really easy. We know that when we hang out our washing, the best time to dry it is a sunny, windy day. It dries out the clothes really quickly. It's exactly the same with the landscape. This was the end of 2019, a dust storm that came over Parks and my place, turned day to night, millions of dollars worth of nutrients and carbon disappearing off our continent with events like that. For the want of some intersection on the paddocks, some cover on the paddocks, and some strategies around doing that at scale. Biodiversity, in simple terms, I realise I'm running out of time here, so we don't eat into other people's times. Again, creating microclimates in the landscape and linking up remnant timbers and so on for biodiversity. So biodiversity can get from one part of the landscape to the other. We can gain carbon credits and biodiversity credits through this, but also our ecosystem services provided in this landscape here. You can see all the wind breaks that are actually stopping the wind from howling across that country and providing something for the environment as well. Water management, it's a big one. Water plus nitrogen equals carbon. So trapping water on the landscape, working out where it's flowing and putting in banks and hydrology management, just absolutely critical. Energy and waste, simple process of keeping the wind off the deck again. So instead of fodder trees or biodiversity plantings, you've got physical structures there slowing the wind down, really good for growing pastures in between as well. All around the world, this is being proven. So this is the largest solar farm in Europe and Serbia, 660 watt, big giant thing. But but here's an agricultural system doing really well as the panels create a productive microclimate for better ag production. So we're trying to integrate via intelligent agroecological design where profit and legacy exist in a virtuous cycle. A really quick flying summary, and if you've got a piece of paper, write some of these down, because this is really what drives the carbon on properties, is to trap water and nitrogen, and you trap carbon. 1 litre of water, you trap between 1 to 4 grams of carbon. It's a nice simple way to think of the management of your landscape. Keep the wind off the deck, create microclimates. Think about your paddocks in terms of microclimates and how much moisture you're losing with wind events. Maximise your natural nitrogen. You've got to get legumes into the system any way you can. You've got to really emphasise the legume component of your systems. Make your soil a one-way valve so you can trap water and trap carbon, and harvest and utilise the freebie. So when you look up into the sky, you're not just looking at the clouds giving you rain. They're the obvious ones, but you're looking at the sunlight. How do I actually capture the most amount of sunlight? Because photosynthesis drives the carbon production and drives the vegetation. So you've got to have plants growing in the landscape to actually capture that sunlight, to capture that carbon, to capture that water, to capture that nitrogen, and manage your gravity on your properties. And number 6, the most important thing, don't fight physics, because physics don't care. Physics will win in the end. So if you think about it in terms of what are the physics of the thing that you're trying to do, and you try to work with nature, work with physics rather than work against it, because if you go toe to toe with physics, physics will win. So thanks very much. That's me in my little spiel on what SoilSquest is up to. If I can just get the share off here. So all those things is each of those 6 icons is where SoilSquest is focusing on. So we've got different projects evolving at the moment where each of those icons are under the lens. So we're developing those projects up as we go. Excuse me, I'm going a bit hoarse now. So up next, we've got Toby Grogan. Toby, thanks for being so patient, and thanks for coming on earlier. We thought you might come on a little bit later, so it's nice to see you here and see the context which is evolving. Toby is part of Impact Ag that has had a bit of press for the last 12 months on various carbon markets that they've been involved with. I won't give any spoilers. I'll hand it over to you, Toby, and you can give some background on what Impact Ag are up to and the context of the carbon markets.
Thanks, Guy. Firstly, can you hear me all right? And can you see my slide deck?
Yep, looking good, Toby.
Yes,
great. So, as Guy said, from Impact Ag, we manage farms all over Australia, and we manage them in a fashion where we are building our natural capital on farm. And when we refer to natural capital, it might be carbon, biodiversity, water cycles, etc. And one of the things I do for the business is try and measure and monetize that natural capital in addition to our farm productivity. So today, that natural capital component that we're talking about is carbon, and Guy's asked me just to give you a bit of a 101 on carbon, on the carbon markets. I know lots on the call will know most of what I'm going to talk to, but I will give you the full run through. So we're talking about 1 carbon credit equaling 1 tonne of CO2 equivalent, which is equivalent to, I think, 3.67 tonnes of soil organic carbon. There's multiple methods for generating a carbon credit, usually through reduced, avoided or sequestered carbon. And again, if you're growing vegetation or building your soil carbon, you're sequestering carbon. All the methods available need to be independently verified and credited, and they can be done through regulated and private markets. So regulated is a government operated market. Private market, typically more common in the US, is non-related to any legislation. And purchases are typically compliance or voluntary. Compliance means they're operating in a regulated market. The government's telling them to find some carbon credits to buy to offset emissions. But what we're seeing more recently is a massive uptake of voluntary purchases where governments, businesses, private sector are seeking to acquire carbon credits to decrease their own emissions. So who are these businesses that are after these carbon credits? This is a slide I've been running for a while, but I could have 20 of these slides. It's every level of government in Australia and overseas. It is major emitters, it's supply chain participants. When I say that, someone like JBS making a commitment to be carbon neutral by 20 whatever. So it's just a growing list of businesses, governments, organisations that are seeking this product that farmers can produce in Australia. How do you verify and credit a carbon credit? On the right of my screen, I've got a whole range of private markets, methods, etc., that are operating, again, typically Europe or the US, that facilitate crediting of carbon credits. The Regen Network is the one in the middle. That was the one that we used, Impact Ag and Wilmot Cattle Company, to sell $1 million worth of soil carbon credits to Microsoft earlier in the year. But in Australia, we're also fortunate to have the Climate Solution Fund, which is the regulated market run by the Australian government, which enables crediting of Australian credit carbon units, and historically enables the government to purchase the vast majority of those to offset national emissions. But increasingly, it enables anyone to generate an Australian credit carbon unit using a approved method and transact that carbon credit to any third party. So what does that market look like? I know this is a busy slide, so I'll just try and talk through it as quickly as I can. This represents the Climate Solution Fund, and prior to being called the Climate Solution Fund, the Emissions Reduction Fund, and its progress to date. So starting at the top, you've got $2.5 billion of taxpayer funds have been committed by the federal government to this market. $830 million have been paid. There's been 499 projects. So this is earlier this year when the government at its 12th auction purchased another round of credits. And at that time, there was 499 registered projects. Down the bottom right, you can see what the government is purchasing via a reverse auction carbon credits for. Not a great price, but they are buying the cheapest, and they provide optional contracts. So often a lot of people will go in, get a optional contract with government in one of their biannual auctions, and then once they've been credited that credit and they've got it available to sell, you know, going forward, people are going to go and find the highest price available. So, you know, certainly selling to government is an option via optional contracts, but it's not the only one. And spot price at the moment is well advanced in comparison to the government's market. The bottom right details how the credits are generated, or the methods that they relate to. So you can see vegetation has got the vast majority, and this is typically the Western rangelands where avoided or human-induced revegetation has generated a vast majority of credits. You can see agriculture. Again, not a lot of that agriculture is soil carbon related, but other methods. But there's more soil carbon projects getting registered at the moment than any of the others. So it's a sign that a lot of people following the 2019 drought are seeing an opportunity to participate, manage their country different, and access another revenue stream for their business. And finally, I think I've got a couple more slides. This one is just to demonstrate what's happening in the carbon markets in Australia and internationally. So that top graph is the spot price of Australian credit carbon units, and you can see what's happened more recently. Now that is being driven by some compliance purchases, so businesses that have to procure some carbon credits due to emissions, but it's also being driven by people that are trying to obtain carbon credits voluntarily to offset their emissions, either because they want to be good corporate stewards or because they can see a risk coming forward that they're going to have to procure credits going forward. The graph down the bottom is just a collection of international carbon prices, and that's up to the end of 2020. All of those have gone on a similar run in 2021. We have got COP26, which is the next international climate change conference in Glasgow in November, where a lot of companies, businesses are going to make greater commitments to reduce their carbon emissions. And in doing so, they will have to rely on offsets or the procurement generation of carbon credits. So all the macro drivers for an increase in carbon price are lining up. And at a time where the regulated and private markets are continuing to evolve and the methods are getting easier to implement, it is still complicated. If it seems complicated, that's because it is. But as there's more businesses like Guy's that are operating, as there's more project developers, as there's more competition and maturity in the market, it's going to be easier for farmers to participate. We've got a new method in Australia for soil carbon getting released later this year. It's going to make it materially easier over the next few years and cheaper to participate. I think I've spoken to the demand consideration, but you'll see that demand for these carbon credits is getting closer to generation. And what I mean by that is they're starting to try and buy project developers. They're trying to finance and forward contract carbon credits because the early movers and now the majority of the market can see there's going to be a crunch in supply at a time when demand is going to skyrocket. And the last point there around co-benefits and getting premium prices, such as we did when we sold credits to Microsoft, there's some of the co-benefits that carbon generated on ag land can provide, things like biodiversity, and Kilter might be able to talk to that point. That's me, Guy.
Thanks, Toby. That's brilliant. It'd be interesting to hear your opinion, I guess, of where you think the carbon market's going from here and how stable the carbon market is. We've seen it evolving really quickly over, even the last 12 months. We've seen lots of changes and new players in the space and lots of appetite from industry and lots more conversations on the political front as well, obviously leading up to COP, driving a lot of that. But I guess if you're a farmer or grazier that hasn't had much experience in this space and you're thinking, okay, what is this market? Is it ephemeral? Is it growing? Is it stable? What are your thoughts, like, if you were to project the next 5 or 10 years and sort of business decisions that you guys are making? Where do you see the stability of this market ending up in that sort of time horizon in a 5 to 10 year period? Yeah,
so look, I think it will. I'm not a forecaster, but it may bounce around given the run it's gone on in 2021. But the projection is for a continued increase in the Australian carbon price, private market carbon prices, international prices. I mean, our regulated carbon credit is at a significant discount to those internationally. So if there's an alignment with regulated carbon prices, it will increase dramatically if Australian carbon credits can be traded internationally. We were, as a business, we're confident enough now to kick off carbon projects as we procure farms, as we implement management change. We're not going to wait for an increase in carbon price. We're not going to sit there with our degraded paddock and wait to improve it just because the carbon price goes up. We know this stacks up. We did a private market transaction only 12 months ago because we had the right historical data, because the Australian domestic method is complicated and expensive, but we also had a low domestic carbon price. A lot of those things are diminishing now. We're participating in the Climate Solution Fund, but it's kind of a horses for courses for us. And in doing so, we were hoping for an Australian credit carbon unit price of $25 by 2025. That was our modelling. today it's in the mid 30s, I think. So even if there is a bit of bounce around, we're well and truly in the black based on a $25 carbon credit price or greater by the time our carbon credit, our soil carbon projects that we're registering today are going to be spinning off carbon credits in 5 or 10 years' time.
And is the whole market driven by the response of industry to climate change action, or do you think there's other mechanisms in the market that is driving it as well?
That's primarily the driver, but some other drivers that we're seeing now, we're getting contacted by major emitters that are trying to procure this stuff today to offset, a higher price down the line. Yeah. Governments are trying to meet their Paris commitments. We've also got investors, financial institutions that are trying to procure these carbon credits as a investment play because they can see them going up. So, I'm not able to provide advice on how people take their carbon credits, but I think some farmers will want to contract their credits and secure, knowing that they've got a secured price. Others may be able to, fund the whole process themselves and trade on an open market. I know some people are using it as a superannuation tool. So, look, the only other comment I'd have, guys, that our exposure to the investment community that we work with, in no time in recent past or historically has there been such a transition of capital away from traditional major emitting economies stampeding towards a low carbon economy future. And in doing so, they're going to need offsets for the foreseeable future. And there's not a lot of those offsets. So high demand, low supply.
That's spells opportunity, doesn't it? It's just working out how to wrangle it. Thanks very much, Toby. It's really heartening to see, again, an organisation up in the stirrups and taking on the challenges. I know some of the backroom stuff that you would have had to go through to actually make those tradings happen wouldn't have been easy. I bet there was a lot of work involved in that, and you're breaking new ground in doing that, and certainly did a lot of good for the industry to have that breakthrough. I think I commend you on the efforts that your organisation's done there, because it's actually brought it to the attention of the industry in quite a large way. And just that alone, I think is a bit of a wake-up call to the whole industry. Are we actually ready for this massive opportunity that's coming down the road at us? And we're sitting here, in some instances, sitting on our hands, not really knowing how we're going to capitalise on all this. And I think the next challenge that is ahead of us is, how do we organise it so that the challenge is easier for people to take on board? The next one, I realise we're running out of time, but that's just what SoilSquest does at their meetings. We just always run out of time. Apologise if I'm holding people up. It is recorded if you do need to go. But I really want to hear from the chaps from Kilter Rural, from Angus and Albie, Albie Ryan, who's the Kilter Rural Carbon specialist. In particular, has got some great information. I might flick over to you, Angus, and you can set up the situation that the Kilter's in at the moment for people, and then I think Albie's going to take us home with some great information.
Really, Guy, thank you, and great to be here today. Big shoes to fill. Certainly not Noel Blair, who's a CSU professor and former New South Wales Primary Industries Minister. But look, guys, I'll just chat for a couple of minutes and hand over to Albie. If you want to share the screen in the meantime, Albie, get yourself a bit sorted. There'll be a little bit of overlap to what Toby's just said, but to give you a bit of a sense of who we are, I hadn't even heard of Kilter, to be completely frank with you. I've been in farming and agribusiness 20 years. I've been now with Kilter for 3.5 years. They flew under the radar with a pretty low profile because they were busy managing their institutional mandate since 2006. What does that mean? They were managing a chunk of capital for Vic Super. How did Kilter come to be? There was really 4 key things. And, it was great listening to you, Guy, before, because there's a lot of overlap with those sort of key management pillars you were discussing, perhaps with the exception of livestock, which is not really core business for us. These are the 4 key things that the Kilter founders pitched to Vic Super back in 2004. Took them a couple of years to actually find an investment to settle on. They said landscape regeneration for sustainable food production, scaled ecosystem protection and biodiversity protection, community regeneration and rejuvenation in rural areas, and climate change preparedness and mitigation. Vic Super was the funder. It had to be in Victoria. They looked all around Victoria for a couple of years and they settled on an area in northwest Vic and set about aggregating small farms that had been over-irrigated. They had bad salinity issues. The community was suffering. You know, the dairy industry in that part of the world was on its knees. And that aggregation is now over 9,000 hectares. It's the largest producer of field tomatoes in the country. I think, to our knowledge, it's the largest grower of irrigated organic cereals in the country. There's about 3,500 hectares irrigated and about 4,000 hectares has been set aside for biodiversity protection. And to our knowledge, it's the largest amount of capital that's been thrown at such a sort of landscape regeneration type project that we know of. So absolute kudos goes to those that had the vision of Vic Super at the time, who have since moved on and retired. And Vic Super has now been swallowed up by Aware Super out of Sydney. Subsequent to that, Kilter's gone on to launch 3 other wholesale investment funds, and one of which I look after, which is really the next iteration of that strategy. It's in North Central Victoria. It's about putting together small, underutilised, undercapitalised farms and balancing high value ag with scaled ecosystem protection. And it all sounds quite good, but what does it mean? Well, we're just trying to do our best to grow crops in a sustainable way, a bit like Guy's presented. You know, last year we did 450 hectares of multi-species cover crops. The picture of Mick Wettenall with a 4-wheeler disappearing was just great. You know, we had a crop that looked like that. It was a Goldilocks year. And this year is shaping up pretty good as well. We're taking farms that had about 3% remnant native vegetation and trying to lift that to between 20 and 30, and where we can register those projects, you know, for carbon sequestration to generate ACCUs. So that's enough about Kilter, really. I want to be brief, and I'll hand over to Albie. He's going to give you a little bit of an overview of our experience in the carbon market, what we're doing, and his views on things. So thanks very much for the time, everyone, and over to you, Albie.
Thanks, Gus. So today I'd like to focus on 3 key points. First, I'd like to share our own experiences in soil carbon and the carbon markets. And then I'll highlight the opportunities present in the national market. And then looking to the international market, I want to highlight 2 key drivers which will affect local markets and soil carbon projects in the next 5 to 10 years. So here at Kilter, we've had a spotlight on soil carbon for the past 10 years. And what we've learned is there are real opportunities in sequestering carbon into the soil. And while the market may seem complex and difficult to navigate, the benefits both financially and to soil health are well worth the investment. So our soil carbon journey began collaborating on research projects with institutions such as Melbourne University, which helped lay the foundations of proof that you could in fact sequester carbon in the soil by changing management practices. We've worked closely with past federal government initiatives, such as the Carbon Farming Initiative since 2012. And this year we registered our first soil carbon project with the ERF on our farmland. And as you can see in the photo, it currently has an impressive deep-rooted canola crop, which is starting the work of increasing the soil carbon content on that property. So our experience shows that soil carbon is an emerging market. There's no perfect information on what the costs involved are, from the costs involved in on-ground measurements to how much implementing these regenerative practices will cost. So there's uncertainty over what profits you can gain from soil carbon projects. However, the barriers to entry are being removed at a rapid pace. Past barriers being lack of research, the additional costs of regen ag, and activities-based models which predict pretty conservative outcomes. But as I'm sure you've heard over this webinar, players like Soil Sequest are changing that game and providing concrete evidence of cropping systems capable of sequestering carbon and storing it long term. And as Toby mentioned before, the ERF is also due to release a new soil carbon method by the end of the year, which will allow farmers to combine on-ground measurement with modelling, which is going to greatly reduce the costs of measurement involved. So moving on to the national market, I'll try and touch on some aspects that Tony hasn't already mentioned. So there's the government-backed ERF, which trades in ACCUs, and then there's other voluntary credits which are independently verified, such as the Regen network. We personally prefer to sell the more rigorous verification approach, which is why we've chosen to go with the ERF over privately verified markets, because what we've seen globally is that to sell high value carbon credits, market investors are seeking offsets which have been certified by rigorous standards. And so the ERF is made up of many forms of carbon credits, from avoided emissions to revegetation projects. But currently in the ERF, soil carbon projects are only being registered with one methodology, which is soil carbon sequestration in agricultural systems. And this method only makes up 12% of the total registered ERF projects. And then of these registered soil carbon projects, they're quite skewed towards grazing, with only 10% of the registered soil carbon projects with the ERF, including management of cropping systems. Now, this is likely based on more research into increasing soil carbon and grazing systems, and often easier to implement management practices compared to cropping. And so the biggest driver in the next 5 to 10 years in the national market, which will increase opportunities for entry, is the rapidly increasing carbon price. I'm sure most of you have been tracking the ACCU prices. The spot price recently hit $30 a tonne, which is an unprecedented increase of 80% in the past year. And while the ERF auction price has remained relatively flat at $16 a tonne, in the next week, we'll see the new auction prices come out, which we're expecting to see hit about $20 a tonne. And while I doubt we'll see an annual rate of growth of 80% continue, most experts agree that the ACCU price is probably going to rise above $40 to $50 a tonne in the next 10 years, which is going to reduce many of the existing barriers to entry and lead to much greater profits as well. Now, moving on to international markets, there's two prominent drivers in international markets which will affect all carbon markets in the next 5 to 10 years. And those are the introduction of high intensity emissions tariffs and tightening regulation on lower quality carbon credits. So as we're already seeing in the EU, where they're on track to introducing the carbon border adjustment mechanism, economies with strong markets will seek to enforce the same regulations on imports coming from countries with weaker emissions reduction schemes, like Australia at the moment. And so these tariffs are predicted to be introduced into most major economies, with the US and Japan currently working on their own. And regardless of whether Australia introduces stronger emissions reduction measures, export industries will be forced into the carbon market, which will lead to more demand for higher quality government regulated offsets. In addition, we'll likely see a shift away from lower quality carbon credits, with more focus placed on rigorous government-backed credits, which can be recognized under national ETS schemes and traded internationally. So the upcoming Glasgow conference is expected to discuss new standards for certified emission reduction units, which will likely reduce the availability of cheap and easy offsets in regulated carbon markets. However, it is worth noting that voluntary markets will continue to operate, as lots of private companies have committed to their own net zero targets. And it's in the private sector internationally where we've seen some really large deals happen, such as Wilmot, and that's probably not going to go anywhere. So just to wrap up, Over our 10 years of experience in soil carbon, we've come across many opportunities and some barriers to entry, but now we're seeing access to soil carbon markets become easier and more profitable than they have been before. And soil carbon projects, especially those in cropping systems, are only a small proportion of the national market. But as we see ACCU prices shoot up and new methodologies come out, we'll see an increase in these projects. And in the international market, two key drivers to watch are the introduction of carbon tariffs and more rigorous standards on carbon credits when they're traded internationally. So yeah, thanks, Guy.
Thanks very much, Albie. So it seems what you're saying there is the international markets are going to have increasingly more influence on our domestic carbon markets.
Yeah.
So and given that the carbon price in Europe is significantly higher in different places around the world than we're experiencing here, that we will see that influence and drive our markets a bit more.
Yeah. It's likely to see that the ACCU price will eventually equal the prices of other international ETS markets, but also perhaps it'll drag down the EU price as well. But yeah.
Okay, it'll find its level spot, level out. Thanks very much for that, Albie. I do realise again we're running late over time. I can't seem to be able to stick to the hour. I don't know what's wrong with me. But we have a few questions here. Steph, you're pretty good at convening the questions. So we might just get our panelists up here. Steve, I know there was an early question for you, but Steph, do you want to read out a couple of the questions?
Yep, sure. So Jennifer West asks Steve, do you have records from your baseline to your SOC levels now? Actual numbers is what everyone wants and needs more than anything else.
On mute there, Steve.
How's that?
Yep, spot on.
Yeah, I have soil test results showing organic carbon levels taken at various times, over a 20-year period, depending on the paddock and some of these, when we actually purchase some of this country. But I do have data, and that's what I'm going to sit down with one of my business partners, and we're going to try and put something together ourselves to see what we can come up with. But yes, I do have soil data, and it's there, and it's available to Guy if he gets his organised to use that data. As I said, we've tracked it in most of our paddocks from when we've purchased the paddock until the present time. In fact, this coming summer, we're going to do the entire operation. It's about 8,000 acres there now that we're going to soil test every paddock and rigorously soil test every paddock to bring all our data up to date.
Great, thanks, Steve. You can put your hands up too down on the reactions icon down the bottom. You can put up your hand if you'd like to ask a question, or you can put it in the chat.
Let me just see if there are other questions. No other questions in the chat at this point. Okay, so it might be up to people to put their hand up if they have anything they'd like to know.
We've stunned them with brilliance by the looks. Anyone got a question?
Yeah, I got a quick question for Steve, if that's all right, guys. Steve, just based on that, the measurements you've got, your baseline being paddocks that have no soil carbon added versus those that have. Is that correct?
Yeah, so normally we always go in and test our country when we buy new paddocks. So we have no idea what the previous history of those paddocks were, but we've got a baseline then. It says our soil carbon level in a paddock was, be what it may, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3% organic carbon. We then implement our own farming system, and then we monitor it as we go along. So we'll do a spot check at different times just to see how it's tracking and if it is increasing. in those paddocks. So far, we've found without exemption that every paddock has increased its soil carbon. Obviously, if you put nothing other than zero till and good management, good stubble management in, soil carbon levels rise. They rise slowly. You come in and put in something like compost, or in some cases we've used biosolids, you'll get those soil carbon levels to jump up very quickly. And then, of course, once they've jumped up, it's a matter of building on that and then maintaining it. Of course, the more soil carbon you get, the slower the build-up becomes in time, but it still seems to be rising all the time. And now our hope is that Guy's technology will be another jumper in the system that will be able to jump it up. Our overall farm goal is to have our soils tracking at about 2% soil carbon if we can.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Good question. Yeah, it's a very poignant question, that one. I think traditionally agriculture hasn't been great at keeping records. That is changing, but it is really important to keep records and to understand what you're testing for and how those testing methodologies take place also, particularly with regard to carbon. If there's no other questions, which I can't see any hands up, but if anyone's got any last minute burning questions, we're running 25 minutes overtime.
I have a quick one.
Yep. Oh, there's a hand up. Sorry.
Right. So we learned this year that under the ERF, the Clean Energy Regulator only allows the prioritization and maybe the authorization of these ACCU carbon credit units for emissions reductions, not for actual drawdown. And yet both in soils and in the seas, we have opportunities to draw down far beyond what might be an emission reduction. And really, it's like looking at two different sides of a ledger where you've got emissions and emission reductions, but we're going to need a lot of drawdown as well. Could anyone comment on the future of the ACCUs and how soon we might expect to see drawdown credits that really aren't limited by some particular industry's emissions?
Albie, that might be a question for you, would it be?
Yeah, sure. So by emissions reduction versus drawdown, could you just clarify what drawdown is? Do you mean sequestration?
Yes, I mean, there are carbon sinks in the soils, there are carbon sinks in the seas. They can far exceed the actual carbon emissions by a particular industry, whether it's agriculture or mariculture in the seas. And yet we found out upon trying to write a proposal for a pilot project that we had to somehow frame it as, oh, we're going to reduce these emissions, as opposed to actually drawing down carbon out of the atmosphere into the soils and seas, regardless of the emissions. They could go to zero. We want to draw down, we got 1,000 or 1,500 gigatons of carbon to pull out of the atmosphere in the next few decades. And the question is, how are we going to do it? And is this going to get monetized in Australia anytime soon?
Yeah, so currently most ERF methods are based on both emissions reduction and sequestration, and you end up getting credited for the net result. So for example, under soil carbon, you might be increasing your emissions a little bit by implementing some new practices or putting compost or fertilizer onto the soil, but you eventually sequester a lot more carbon in the soil than you emitted. And so the end result is the net emissions sequestered after you've taken into account all the emissions from the project. So it's effectively drawdown minus emissions. And that's in most ERF methods. I'm sure there's a few that are just based on emissions reductions only, but we'll probably see those become less and less common and more of a focus on drawdown / sequestration of emissions, as they're considered sort of higher quality and more important than, a large factory reducing their emissions by a small amount.
Interesting, yeah. And ERF probably stands for emissions reduction. I think we were advised this year that we had to somehow phrase a new methodology in the context of, how it's going to reduce emissions, but we're much more interested in kind of the drawdown dimensions of it. Are you saying that the emissions might be zero and you could still draw down, or very low, and you could draw down vastly more carbon than is being emitted by even a particular industry, perhaps?
Yes.